React is awesome, but I think it has a fair reputation as being overly complex and intimidating to beginners. So in this video, I want to keep things as simple as possible. So it's a true intro or tutorial for beginners, and I want to spend more energy on understanding core concepts instead of getting into way too much complexity too early on. So here's what we're going to cover in this video. We're going to learn, first of all, what problem does React solve? Like, why are we even bothering to use React in the first place? After that, how do you create your first React project? And then what is JSX? What is a component? What is a prop? How do you loop through an array? What is state? How do you handle events? How do you work with forms and inputs? And finally, what is useEffect? Or how do you work with the browser's local storage or an external API or any sort of external system? In other words, we're going to learn the core concepts of React itself, not its ecosystem and third-party packages, because I'm here to say, slow down. So this is the face of any new to React developer when you tell them that they need to use Next and Zustand and ShadCN and Motion and Zod before they've even created a Hello World React app. You don't need to worry about all of that. That can come later. So I'm here to tell you right now that the React ecosystem is amazing. It's one of its biggest strengths, but that can wait. You don't need to worry about that right this minute. So don't inherit an entire ecosystem before you can even display Hello World properly. And for now, you just need to relax so that you can actually learn core concepts. It's okay, I give you permission. You don't need to use the cool kid packages right away. It's not like you're going to get banned from ever having a job if you don't use every single trending package your first day of using React. So let's spend this video together just understanding the core concepts of React itself. Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to ask ourselves, where do we begin? We're actually going to answer that by answering two other important questions. So number one, what is React? And number two, what problem does React solve? So question number one is really easy to answer. What is React? Well, we can see from the official React website that React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. So that's what React is, and we know that we want to learn React because it's incredibly popular and companies that are hiring developers want us to know it. But why? Why do they want us to know it? Why is React so popular? Well, that brings us to the actual crucial question that we're going to spend this entire video on. And that is, what problem does React solve? This question is so important because if you don't know what problem a tool is solving, you're setting yourself up for failure. From the very beginning, you fundamentally will not understand the tool. I've seen this time and time again. If a student doesn't begin by seeing why we use React, they'll usually give up learning it because it seems like too much work for no real payoff. You'll see this a lot with burnt out or frustrated developers. They talk negatively about React, but when you hear them try to describe why the industry uses React in the first place, you can tell they have no clue what they're talking about. So, of course, they're not going to understand or enjoy React. And that's not their fault. It's the fault of teachers and learning materials. But this course is designed from the ground up to be different. We take the time to understand why we're doing what we're doing. And this allows people who might have otherwise struggled with React to finally understand it. Hence the name of the course, React for the Rest of Us. Because you don't need to be a genius to get React. You just need an actual teacher instead of someone reading off microwavable popcorn instructions to you. So in this first video, we are not going to actually touch React at all. Instead, we're going to look at two different ways we can create user interfaces with JavaScript without React or without a library whatsoever, right? Just plain vanilla JavaScript. We're going to look at the pros and cons for both of these coding approaches and then walk through how React fits into this picture and how React gives us the pros of both approaches without the cons of either approach. This will show us the problem that React is solving, and seeing that will make learning React 100 times easier. Not only because you'll have a frame of reference and a context for everything, but because by seeing why React is so special, You'll have a motivation and reason to power through the challenge of learning it, right? You'll feel compelled to take advantage of React in your projects. So, by the end of this video, we'll have a general idea of why React is useful, and then in our very next video, we can actually get our hands dirty and start using React. At this point, let's jump into the real action of this lesson. So the two coding approaches that we're going to look at are what I would call the DOM-focused approach and the data or declarative view approach. Now, I've actually set up a working CodePen example for each one of these approaches. If you'd like to dig through my example code, you can find the links to these CodePens in the resources for this lesson, but you do not need to do that. You can just watch me talk about the code in this very video. So in this tab, here's one approach. In this tab, here's the other approach. And the actual application is identical. So you can see down here, I can fill out this form and say, walk the dog, and create that item. I can create another item, feed the cat, buy vegetables. And then if I want to delete one, if I want to delete feed the cat, you can just click delete. If I want to update one, I can say buy vegetables and fruits. You get the idea. And then the same thing is true for this coding approach as well, right? This is the exact same application, it's just coded in a different fashion. So I can say feed the cat, walk the dog, buy groceries. So the application itself is the same, but they were created using very different philosophies or approaches. And consequently, they each have their own unique set of pros and cons, or strengths and weaknesses. And the key point here is that neither approach is ideal. So let's take this first example, what I'm calling the DOM-focused approach, and let's break down its problems. By the way, DOM stands for Document Object Model, and that just refers to the web browser's model of the actual content or elements on the page. So with this coding approach, these actual LI or list item elements, these are the source of truth or source of data for our application. So for example, this JavaScript code, let me scroll down a bit, this listens for the form element being submitted, right, when you create a new item. And instead of adding that new item to a raw JavaScript array of data, well, this DOM-focused approach literally just adds a new LI list item element to this unordered list or UL element. And the same is true for when you click on one of the delete buttons. Instead of removing an item from a raw JavaScript array of data, we are just literally removing that LI element from this UL element. And then because I want to persist our data even if you reload or refresh the page, right? So even if I click refresh, you can see that our two items are still here. To make that happen, I'm using the web browser's local storage feature. So each time you create a new item or edit or delete an existing item, I'm saving all of our data into local storage. And then when you first load up this page or refresh the page, I'm loading or pulling that data from local storage. Now, this need to save and load data begins to really show the problems with this DOM-focused approach. Because we don't want to save the actual HTML for this entire LI or list item element, right? We only want to save the actual text values for each item. So you can see in our JavaScript, I'm performing this weird, awkward dance with the DOM. I'm saying, let's begin with our list, our unordered list, select all of its list items, and then I'm going to loop through each one of them. And I'm going to look for the span element inside of them that has a class of value, and that's going to get me just this actual piece of the element instead of the entire element. And then I need to say grab the inner HTML, right, the actual text or value for that item. And then that way I actually do have an array of the items and I can save those into local storage. Now, technically this approach works, but it's a nightmare for so many different reasons. Primarily because working with the DOM is relatively slow even on the fastest computers in the world. Whereas even on older, slow computers, the browser's ability to work with raw JavaScript data is blazing fast. So whenever possible, if we can avoid working with the DOM, we absolutely should avoid working with it. So it sort of goes without saying that it's not ideal for the DOM to be our source of truth or source of data. So that's the first problem with this approach. The second huge problem is that the code that makes up our user interface is fragmented all over the place, right? Some of it's here, some of it's here, some of it's here. And we end up having to babysit tons of different elements manually instead of just having one convenient, centrally located place for our interface. Now, yes, this approach does work for very, very simple applications, but as soon as the complexity of your project grows at all, it becomes a nightmare to have to mentally keep track of where you are manually babysitting each element in different locations throughout your code. It's just a recipe for messy spaghetti code and an unnecessarily stressed out life for you as a developer. So that's the first of the two approaches that we're going to look at in this lesson. Now let's change gears and look at the second approach, or the data or declarative view approach. And again, remember that neither of these two approaches are using React or any library. They are both just plain vanilla JavaScript. So in this approach, we can see how it gets its name around line number 19 or 20. So I've created this function named render, and then here in one centralized location in the code, our entire user interface is declared. Right? We have the form with the input field, we have the unordered list. Inside the unordered list, we're looping through our data and we're outputting a li or list item element for each to-do item. And when the user tries to create a new item with this form, or when this form is submitted, you can see I'm calling a function named submitHandler. So if we go take a look at that function, you can see that this function does not babysit the DOM or directly worry about modifying the DOM in any way. All it does is take a raw JavaScript array of data and push a new item onto that array. Right? And then once we've done that, I'm calling a function named saveData, which is going to save it to local storage, but then also the saveData function is going to call the render function. And I'm taking the same approach for when someone clicks on the delete button for one of the items. Instead of manually babysitting any of the elements, I'm just going to remove that item from our raw array of data and then run the render function again. So the idea is that whenever we modify our app's data, we call that render function. And render has our entire user interface declared in one convenient location. Now at first glance, this approach might seem way better than the first approach, the DOM-based approach. Right? This data or declarative view approach lets us keep things more organized, and we don't have to do any awkward dancing with the DOM because the DOM is not our source of truth. Our raw JavaScript data is the source of truth. However, there is one huge problem with this approach that is even bigger than any of the problems with the first DOM-based approach. So yes, it's nice and convenient to have our interface defined in this one centralized place, but that convenience comes at a price. Because now, whenever any data changes in our app, we are re-rendering the entire application. And remember that working with the DOM and telling the DOM to re-render or repaint content is very slow. So even if we really only need to update the text for one item or just delete one of these items, our entire application, including the form and potentially hundreds of items, they're all going to get re-rendered. And that is a performance and speed nightmare. And it's going to result in an application that feels slow, unresponsive, and just weird for the end user. Now, if we contrast this with our first approach, the DOM-focused approach, in this case, when we added a new element, we only rendered that one specific new element. Or when we deleted an element, we actually just removed that one li list item from the page. Right? We only manipulated the one tiny piece of the DOM that actually needed to be manipulated because it was now different. That is what we want to do. That's what creates fast and responsive feeling front-end applications. However, that's really the only area where this DOM-focused approach excelled. Everything else about this approach feels messy and unorganized. So at this point, we're conflicted because aside from that one huge performance issue with the second approach, it seems like the second approach is the clear winner. So the question becomes, is there any way that we can get the best of both worlds of these two approaches? Is there any way that we can have our cake and eat it too? Well, yes, we can. And this is exactly where React comes into play. React is closer to the second or the data declarative view approach. So with React, imagine if we could declare our interface in one centralized place, and then whenever the data for our app changed, instead of the entire interface getting re-rendered, somehow, magically, only the exact tiny pieces of the DOM that actually need to display new or changed content, only those little pieces actually get manipulated in the DOM. Well, that's React in a nutshell. Now, yes, React is not the only library that does this. There are many libraries that offer us this same approach, like Angular and Vue.js, but in my opinion, React is the most beautifully simple solution. I mean, it's even in the very name of the library, React. We can just worry about our app's data, and our user interface will automatically react to that data. So big picture, that's the problem that React solves. It lets us keep our data outside of the DOM so that working with the data is simple and blazingly fast. And as our data changes, it reacts by re-rendering only the exact tiny pieces of the DOM that actually need to be re-rendered because they are now different. Trust me, it might not seem like much, but this is an incredibly powerful approach. And yes, it will take some time and practice, but throughout this course, we are going to wrap our minds around this React way of doing things. And it's going to completely change the way we build interfaces for the better. So now that we have a frame of reference for why we should use React, other than just because it's popular, we are in a great position to move forward. And in our very next lesson, we are going to get our hands dirty and actually start using React together step by step. Let's keep things rolling. I'm so excited to get started with you, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to get our hands dirty and actually start using React. Let's jump right into the action. So right now, I want you to follow along with me. So in a new tab, visit CodePen. You can either Google for CodePen or just visit codepen.io. Okay, and we want to begin by clicking on this Start Coding or Create New Pen button. That should take you to a screen that looks something like this, and now we can begin experimenting and writing code. There are different areas for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then down here, you'll see a preview of what your code creates. So if in the HTML area, we say, hello, we see that in the preview area. But this is not a course about typing the word hello in HTML. This is a course about React, and React is a JavaScript library. So we are interested in this JavaScript column, and before we even begin writing any JavaScript code, we need to set up a few options. So towards the right-hand side of the JavaScript area, you'll see this little settings or gear icon. Go ahead and click on that gear or settings icon. Okay, and what we need to do is add in the React library. We do this by scrolling down towards the very bottom of this screen, and we're interested in this area where you can add NPM packages. So to be clear, if I scroll up just a little bit, I am not interested in this area where you can add external scripts. So not that area. If you scroll down a little bit more, and the interface might change a little bit in the future, but we're looking for this area where you can use NPM packages. From that area, I can click on this field, and if I search for React, awesome, it should be the first option. So click on that, and then we need one other package, which is called React-DOM. React can also be used to create native applications like for a phone. In this case, we're building something that belongs in a web browser. So in addition to the base React package, we also need the React-DOM package. So go ahead and click on that. And then we're ready to close this screen. So just close it here. Okay, and now in your JavaScript area, you should have these two import lines. We do need to make a quick change to the React-DOM line. So at the very end of that line, after the React-DOM, but before the closing quote, we need to add on / and then just the word client, just like this. Without this, your code will not work, and this is because React DOM can be used on the server side or on the front end or the client side. So again, just be sure to add on /client, just like this. At this point though, we are ready to now actually start using or leveraging React. That's right, we're going to write our first React-based application right here in the web browser within CodePen. I see way too many React tutorials make the mistake of having you install a bunch of tools and packages on your computer before even having you touch or understand React at all. Now don't worry, later in the course we will indeed learn how to work with React locally on your computer with the exact workflow tools that professionals use. But for right now, CodePen is perfect because we just want to be able to see the big picture and experiment with React. Right? We're not actually trying to build the next Fortune 500 app right now in this very moment. Okay, let's get started by trying to use React to output an H1 or heading level 1 element onto the web page. So without JavaScript or without React, we could just come over to the HTML section and say heading level 1, hello. And clearly that gets the job done. But in dynamic apps, you'll often want to control your interface with JavaScript. So let's begin by giving our JavaScript something to hook onto in the HTML. So in the HTML column, let's get rid of that heading level 1. And instead, let's have an empty div. And in order for the JavaScript to hook onto this, let's give it an ID. And we could choose any value for its ID, but just so you and I are on the same page, let's name it app. Okay, now let's use React to render an H1 or heading level 1 element into this div. So just for screen space reasons, we don't need to look at the CSS column, so I might drag this like this. And in the JavaScript, let's say const root, so I'm just making up a variable name, but the first thing we want to do is tell React which element on the page is sort of the root for our application, or which element would we want to render into. So let's say root equals React DOM dot, and then we're going to call a method called create root. In these parentheses, we just select this div. So that would be document.query selector, parentheses to call that, string of text, hashtag app to select the element that has an ID of app. Now that particular code that we just typed in, and this code that I'm highlighting right now, this has nothing to do with React. This is just standard or universal JavaScript that lets us select an element. But now that we have selected that element and told React which element should be the root for our application, now we're ready to actually render something. So on a new line, we can use our root variable. We just say root, and it has a method called render that we want to call. Now in these parentheses, we just spell out what we want to render. And the React way of doing that would be to just say uppercase React dot create element, and parentheses to call that. Okay, and remember what we wanted to render was a heading level 1 element. So the React way of doing that, within these parentheses, we want to give it 3 arguments. So we could say A, B, C, just as placeholders. Okay, the first argument is the type of element or component that you want to create. So instead of the A, we can say quotes H1, right? That's the type of element we want to create. The second argument is properties or props. For now, we don't need to worry about what that means. We will learn about props in a future lesson. For now, instead of the B placeholder, we can just say null. Okay, and then instead of the C placeholder, this is where we define any content or children that should live in this element. So in our case, instead of the C placeholder, let's have a string of text, so quotes, and let's say our amazing app header. I just zoomed out a bit so the code fits all on a single line. If you need to pause the video and zoom in and type this out with me, that's okay. But once you have this typed in, you'll see down in the preview area, we have successfully rendered our first bit of content using React. You probably have 2 thoughts right now. Number 1, this syntax seems very unintuitive and like a lot of typing just to create an element. And thought number 2 is that you're probably thinking that just rendering a header is not very impressive. Well, you would be right on both accounts. So for number 1, don't worry about this syntax and how verbose or unintuitive it is. We will learn about an easier and more intuitive way of creating React elements in our very next lesson. Okay, and regarding thought number 2 about rendering a header not being impressive, well, it's not. So right now, let's add a bit more content to the page. So maybe below our header, let's add a standard paragraph. And then below that, let's add a small footer. Now, this is already a very long line of code. So instead of adding even more to it, let's do this. On a brand new line right above this, let's create a function. So function, and let's name this function our app. Parentheses, curly brackets. And just to make sure you're on the same page as me, I capitalized the O in our and the A in app. Now, before we talk about what should go in the body of our function here, I first want to say that for the remainder of this video recording, you will not see these 2 lines at the top of my screen here, these import lines. Please pay no attention to that. Please absolutely keep these import lines intact. This is the modern new way of using React in a browser environment like CodePen like this. So we definitely want to leave these intact. Essentially for the remainder of the video though, this will look like the top of my screen. You'll still follow along with me character by character. Nothing else has changed in the newest version of React, but absolutely leave these 2 import lines up here intact. Okay, now within the body of this function, we want to return. And then in order to save a bit of typing, we just want to copy and paste this react.createElement call. So just select from react.createElement all the way to the end of the closing parentheses for that. Copy that. And then within this function, right after the word return, just paste. Okay, now here's how we can actually use this function. Down here, when we are rendering, since we've defined the heading up here, we no longer need to define it here. So for example, instead of this our amazing app header text, let's get rid of that text and the quotes around it and just say null. And actually, if both the second and third arguments are null, we don't need to even include either of them. So we can just get rid of both of these arguments. And now, instead of rendering a heading level 1 element, we want to render a our app element. Right? We essentially just created our own custom React element or component. So for this first argument, instead of quotes h1, we don't even need the quotes. We can just say our app. Cool. You'll know that you set things up correctly if you once again see this down in the preview area. So big picture, this is where we define our reusable blueprint of what an our app element or component should be. And then this is where we are actually using or leveraging or rendering an our app element. Okay, now at this point, let's adjust our app element to also contain a standard paragraph and also a small footer. In order to do that, we're going to need to adjust things a bit up here. Because an element that we're creating with React can only have one top-level element. But the good news is that one top-level element can contain as many children or nested elements as we want it to. So do this with me. Right now I want you to copy this create element and then the parentheses. So copy that into your clipboard. Okay, and then let's do this. Let's change the heading level 1 to instead be a div. Just a generic container or wrapper div that other content can live within. Don't worry, in a future lesson we will learn about something called a React fragment, so you don't even need to add an unnecessary div to your markup. But for right now, this will do the trick. Okay, now here's where things get interesting. Remember, the third argument is the children or the content. So just get rid of these quotes and that text, and instead we want to include an array. So opening and closing square brackets. And now inside these square brackets, within this array, we can include as many React elements as we want to include. So to stay organized, we could even drop down in between the opening and closing brackets. And this is where you can paste in your clipboard again. So paste. Whoops, I actually led you astray when I told you what to copy and paste. At the beginning of this line that I just pasted, there should actually be uppercase react dot create element. Just like this. If you need to pause the video to type this out, that's a-okay. Or remember, if you don't want to type this out, you can always find a link to the finished product code for each video in the resources for the lesson. Okay, cool. So within this array, we have our one heading level 1 element. Now, if you just copy this line, right, we just want to duplicate it. So at the end of that line, you can include a comma, and then you can drop down to stay organized and just paste it in again. Only this time, instead of a heading level 1, we would want this to be a P for paragraph. And for the text, let's say the current time is blank. And then in just a few moments, we can come back and fill this in with the actual current time. Cool, so we see that down here. And then finally, let's add a comma at the end of that line and include one more element. Instead of heading level 1, let's say that it should be a small element. And for its content, we can just say copyright footer text. Cool, so things are looking good. Now, instead of this saying blank, let's have this actually say the current time. So this has nothing to do with React, but within this string of text here, if we change the opening and beginning quotes to be backticks instead, then we can do something dynamic within the string. So get rid of the opening quote, have a backtick. This character is to the left of the 1 key or right above the tab key. And then get rid of the closing quote, replace it with a backtick. Just one backtick, not 2 at the end. Okay, and then instead of the word blank here, let's get rid of the word blank. And then to do something dynamic, we can say $ curly brackets. And inside these brackets, we can have an expression. So let's create a new instance of a date object. After those parentheses to call date, say dot to locale string parentheses to call that. Cool, so notice down here now, the current time is, and then it says the date and time. So that's great, and that is the current time when this page first renders or loads, but then it's just going to sit there forever and never update. Well, we can do better than that. We are using React after all, so let's set things up so that we update the time once every second to actually show the current time. Now, in future lessons, we can learn about the standardized or most elegant way of updating React like that. But for now, we can actually use a really simple standard JavaScript approach. So do this with me. Down at the very, very bottom of our code, we have this line that reads root.render. Go ahead and cut that entire line of code into your clipboard because we're going to want to paste it back in just a moment. Okay, but with it temporarily out of the way, type this out with me. Set uppercase I interval. Within these parentheses, we give it 2 arguments. So you could say a comma b. The first argument is a function that you want to run. And the second argument is how many milliseconds you want to wait before running said function again. And this is just going to repeat endlessly. So for the second argument, instead of b, we could say wait 1,000 milliseconds. And then for the function that we want to run, instead of the a placeholder, we can just include an anonymous function, or you could include an ES6 arrow function if you want to, but function, parentheses, curly brackets, and then in the body of this function, just paste back in your clipboard. Cool, and now notice your time is being updated every second. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, what's the big deal, right? Set interval has nothing to do with React. Every web browser can do that by default. Well, that's true, but let me explain React's superpower that we're seeing right now. So if you actually click and drag and highlight this time paragraph, notice that after every second that passes, it gets unselected, right? The web browser loses our selection of text. However, if you select our large heading level 1, that selection does not get lost. And if you select the footer, that's not being lost. The reason this is lost when you select it is because it's having to be re-rendered every second. So the real magic of React here is that we declared our entire interface in one convenient location, right? The entire layout. And then we are telling that entire layout to re-render once every second, but it's not actually re-rendering the entire thing. Only that one tiny little part of the DOM that actually needs to get updated and replaced is actually getting re-rendered. And this is amazing for performance reasons. This lets us have the best of both worlds, right? A cohesive declarative view and blazingly fast rendering performance. Now don't get me wrong, there's a lot more to React than just this, but in my opinion, this is the heart and soul of why I think React is so amazing. Now, if you're anything like me, throughout this entire lesson, you've been looking at this syntax of react.createElement and then having to have 3 arguments, and then it can get really weird really quickly if you have to nest other elements inside other elements. Well, I have some good news. In the real world, most React developers do not use this syntax. Instead, we use something called JSX. And it makes creating elements and components with React a piece of cake. Essentially, almost as easy as just writing plain HTML. Now, technically, behind the scenes, JSX is just going to convert the code that looks intuitive into code that looks exactly like this. So I do think it was important for you to see sort of behind the scenes of how React actually works. But in our very next lesson, we are going to learn about the wonderful, the amazing, the incredibly intuitive JSX. I'm so excited to jump into that with you, so let's keep things rolling, and I'll see you then.
Hello everyone. This is a very quick note to let you know that we need to keep these import React and React DOM lines intact. Over the next 8 or so video lessons, you will not see these at the top of my screen, so it will look something like this instead, but I'm just letting you know absolutely keep these intact. This is the correct modern approach to have things work wonderfully here in CodePen. You can see if I remove these 2 lines, my application immediately stops working. So really quick, let me just remind you how to get those lines back. From the JavaScript gears or setting icon, we can click on that. From this screen, scroll down to the very bottom where we see Add Packages. This is going to let us have NPM packages. And just search for React, click that, and then also we want React-DOM. Go ahead and click that. You can close this screen. There is one tiny change though. For the React DOM package, after the end of DOM but before the closing quote here, you want to add on /client. As soon as I do that, you can see my application begins working perfectly once again. One last quick note, if you go into the settings or gear icon again for JavaScript, here you see JavaScript preprocessor. In our next lesson, we are going to want to set that to Babel. Or Babel, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but you can just set that value, click close, now you're in business. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I'll see you in the next video.
Hello everyone. In this lesson, we are going to answer the question, what is JSX? Let's dive right into the action. So in our previous lesson, we wrote a bit of React code to create this user interface. So our code got the job done, but this react.createElement syntax feels really verbose. And if we're being honest, it feels like too much typing for the results that we're getting. Well, luckily, there's a much easier way to create elements with React. And this is where something called JSX comes into play. Instead of trying to describe what JSX is with words, let's just see it in action. So right now, follow along with me in the same CodePen from our previous lesson. Or if you closed your window, you can always just use the finished product link from the previous lesson. Okay, but before we can use JSX, we need to change a setting in CodePen. So do this with me. Within the JavaScript column in CodePen, right to the left of the JS label, we see the settings icon or the gear icon. Go ahead and click on that. And then where we see JavaScript preprocessor, you want to select that and choose Babel. I've actually heard it pronounced both Babel and Babel, but click the one that says Babel. Okay, and then we can close this window. And we are ready to begin using JSX. So check this out. Instead of this mess of 4 different react.createElements and the different arguments and everything, watch how clean this is. We can empty out the entire body of this function. Right? So it's just function rwrap, the body's empty, and we're just going to return a pair of parentheses, and then inside these parentheses we can drop down. You can drop down one more time so there's an empty line like this, And now we are free to begin writing JSX. Now, at first glance, this is going to look like HTML, but it's not. So follow along. Let's create an opening and closing div tag. And then inside that div, we can create a heading level 1 and say, our amazing app header. After the H1, we can drop down and create a paragraph. Inside it, say the current time is, and for now we can just say blank. And then below that, we can create a small element. And inside it, say copyright footer text. Cool, so that creates the exact same result, only this code is about 5,000 times more intuitive than the react.createElement code. To the untrained eye, this just looks like simple HTML, whereas in reality, this is something called JSX. In other words, it looks like HTML, but it's really JavaScript, because JSX is a syntax extension to JavaScript. Behind the scenes, this code is going to get converted into a bunch of different react.createElement calls. But you and I don't need to worry about that. We can just write this intuitive code. So this looks like HTML, but it's not. So let me walk you through a few of the key differences. First of all, yes, we can still only have one top-level element, right? So that's why I have this wrapper div. But check this out. On this opening div, we can actually get rid of the letters div. So it's just an opening tag and a closing tag. And this is what's referred to as a React fragment. So this way, React won't actually output an unnecessary wrapper div into your markup. But technically, for the sake of React, we still just have that one top-level element. Okay, another difference that I want to point out right away would be if we wanted to add a class to one of these elements. For example, what if we wanted our header to be orange? So open up your CSS panel in CodePen, and imagine we have a class named Special, and we say color should be orange, right? And then we want to apply this class of Special to the heading level 1. Well, in regular actual HTML, you would just say class equals, but class is a reserved or special word in JavaScript, and this is actually just JavaScript. So instead, we would say class name, and that's an uppercase N, equals special. Cool, so now our header is orange. Next, let's work on replacing the word blank with the actual time value again. So here that is in our code. Now in our previous lesson, we were within a traditional JavaScript string of text. Or I should say, instead of quotes, we used backticks to create a template literal, and then we could include something dynamic with $ curly brackets. Well, this time around, we're not in regular JavaScript, we are within JSX. And in JSX, when you want to include a bit of actual regular JavaScript, you just need to include curly brackets. So we can get rid of the word blank and just curly bracket pair. And inside here, we can include JavaScript. So we can just say, create a new instance of a date object, parentheses to call it, and then say dot to locale string, parentheses to call that. Perfect. We can see that our time is once again updating every second. And now, if you select this entire line of code, it appears as if it's not even re-rendering. However, if you select just part of the time portion, you can see that your selection is lost and it is indeed being re-rendered. But if you select the header, you can see that the entire view is not being re-rendered. This is perfect. So all of the same features of React that we are so impressed with are still here. It's just that now we can use a more intuitive syntax. Okay, and also, since our CodePen is now set up to use Babel, so we can use JSX, we can also scroll down to the bottom of our JavaScript. And down here, when we are actually rendering our component, we can simplify this as well. Because JSX is in the picture, we can now delete this react.createElement parentheses our app. And instead, we can just include something that looks like an opening HTML tag. Or I should say a self-closing HTML tag. Right? So the JSX way of doing this is just less than symbol. And the name of our function or component is our app. and then a forward slash and a greater than symbol, right? So that looks sort of like an HTML tag, but this is the JSX way of rendering a component with this name. Now, there's more to JSX than just what we've covered in this lesson, but this is more than enough to get us rolling. We will learn more about JSX as and when necessary. For now, let's change gears and talk about what we're going to cover in our next lesson. So right now, our entire interface is defined right here, and that's fine because each one of our three sections, right, the header, our content, and the footer, each section is only one line of code. However, in the real world, your header might be made up of 100 or even 1,000 lines of code. And then your content might be 1,000 lines of code, your footer could be a few hundred lines of code. So, from the perspective of staying organized, we'd want to be able to separate our code or sections into different pieces instead of just one giant blob of text. Now don't worry, our entire interface will still ultimately be assembled or described here, but by learning how to break our code into separate components and then have one component leverage another component, we are going to take our organization skills to another level. I'm so excited to jump into this with you and show you what I'm talking about. So let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson.
Hey, if you're enjoying this video, you might enjoy my complete course on React. In that course, we build a meaningful spa, and we take a similar approach. We don't worry too much on using every trending package. We do use React Router, and we create this fully functioning social network app. Users can follow each other. There's a live chat, a live search component. It's fun to build something worthwhile. So you can find a link to join my full course in the description in the pinned comment. Let's get back to this video.
Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to see how one React component can use or leverage another React component. Let's jump right into the action. So in our previous lesson, we wrote a bit of JSX code, and our entire interface is defined or declared right here. At the moment, this still feels relatively organized because each one of our sections, right, the header, content, and footer, each section is only one line of code. But in the real world, our header might be hundreds or thousands of lines of code. With this in mind, one of the key concepts in React is breaking down your code into bite-sized or sort of single responsibility components. To show you what I mean, I want you to follow along with me right now. So let's use our imagination, and let's imagine that our heading was actually 500 lines of code instead of just this one heading level 1. Well, in that case, it would make sense that we'd want to store that code somewhere else and then just reference or point towards that code here. So here's how I would do that. Let's scroll down a bit. So maybe right below our app function, we can just drop down and let's create a brand new function. So type this in with me, function. We could name it anything we want, but let's name it our header. So that's capital O and then capital H, parentheses, curly brackets. Okay, and then within the body of this function, we can just return. And then if we wanted to have multiple lines of HTML, or I should say multiple lines of JSX, you would have parentheses and then you could drop down. But if you're only going to have a single element, right, or a single line of code, you don't need the parentheses. So we can just return a heading level 1 and inside it say our amazing app header. Okay, so this function represents a new separate component named our header. So then if we scroll back up to our main application component, well, check this out. We can remove this heading level 1 and instead in its place just say less than symbol our header / greater than symbol. Cool, we see that that is successfully rendered. It's no longer orange because I forgot to add that. So if you scroll down to our header on this H1, you could say class name equals special. Now, yes, our header is still only one line of code, but that's not the point. If our header was 100 lines of code, you could store that in this component, right? You could just wrap this in parentheses. And the idea is that our main component just references or points towards that component. So this is still our one centrally located or cohesive place to assemble or define or declare our interface, but pointing or leveraging other components within this component lets us stay super organized. Now, practice makes perfect, so let's practice turning our content area and our footer into components. Let's start with our time paragraph. So select that element and copy it into your clipboard. And then if we scroll down, we can create a new function. Say function. We could name it anything we want, but just so we're on the same page, let's call it time area, parentheses, curly brackets, and then we just return and then paste in your clipboard. And again, in the real world, you'd probably have more than one element or more than one line of code. In that case, you would just have parentheses, and then you could include as many lines of JSX as you want. But we just have one line, so return, paste. Okay, then back up in our app, instead of that actual paragraph here, we can just say time area / close out that tag. Cool, and let's do the same thing for our footer. So I would just copy this into my clipboard. Go and create a function. Let's name it footer and just have it return and paste in that text. Then up here, instead of actually including that, we can just say footer. Cool, so this way we're still declaring our interface in one central place, only now, even if each one of these sections took up hundreds or thousands of lines of code, well, our bird's eye view of the app is very clean and intuitive and easy to look at and make sense of. Now at this point, I want to transition into our next topic, which is making components flexible. So in React, a component is reusable, meaning you define what a component should be once, and then you can use it or render it as many times as you want. So for example, let's take our header. We could render not just one our header, but 2 or 3. So if I copied this and then just right below it, include it another 2 times, right? Then down in the preview area, we see 3 headers. Now in our particular example, it doesn't make sense to show the header more than once, but you can imagine that in a real world application with real content and real data, you would absolutely want to render certain components more than once. Right? Like a list of user data or a list of blog posts or status updates. And this idea of reusing components like this brings us to the topic for our next lesson, which is properties or props. Props let us pass data into a component, which really lets the component come alive in terms of being flexible and reusable. Props are definitely one of the aha moments of learning React. So I'm really looking forward to this next lesson with you. Let's keep things rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to learn about one of the most important topics in React, and that is props or properties. Let's dive right in. Okay, now to set the stage or give ourselves a bit of context, I actually want to begin in this lesson by talking about regular, traditional old HTML for a moment. So in regular HTML, we can give elements attributes, right? Like this div has an ID attribute, or we can give an element a class. We can give an A element the href attribute, right, to create a link, and that's its value. We can give the image element a source attribute and point towards an image file. Well, in React, when we create a component, we're essentially creating our own custom element type. Only we're not limited to the specific attributes that HTML allows. In React, we can use something called props to give any attribute or piece of data to any component. We can make up our own new crazy props or attributes or whatever we want. Now to show you what I mean and for you to see props in action, let's give ourselves a goal. Let's imagine that we want to display information about several different animals or pets on our web page. Right? Maybe for each pet we want to display their name, their species, and their age. So let's make it happen. Right now I want you to follow along with me. So in the JavaScript column, let's get to work. Before we adjust our overall interface, let's first create a new component and name it pet. So to do that, we can just create a brand new function. So function, and let's name it uppercase pet, just so we're on the same page. So function pet, parentheses, curly brackets. And for now, let's just have it return a list item element. And inside the list item, let's just say this is a pet. Okay, now we said that we wanted to have maybe 3 or 4 or 5 pets on our page. So now let's use this component. So up at the top in our app component, how about right below the time area, we add a bulleted list or unordered list, right? So UL for unordered list, close that out. In between those opening and closing tags, let's just have maybe 3 pets. And again, that's uppercase P for pet. So that's 1, let's have a second one, and let's have a third. Okay, and if we check the preview area, there we see the 3 pets. Only we want to display actual information for each pet, like their name, species, and age. So let's go down to our pet component function, and let's change the actual text inside the list item. So instead of just this is a pet, let's say blank is a blank and is blank years old. Right? And then in reality, it would say something like meows a lot is a cat and is 5 years old. Now, before we worry about swapping out these blanks with actual values within our reusable component here, let's first go up to the very top, right, where we are leveraging the pet component 3 times in a row. And this is where I want to show you what a prop is. So remember, just like we can add attributes to a traditional HTML element, well, in React, we can essentially just add attributes to our components. So right after pet, we can just say name equals, make up a name, I'll say meows a lot. We can give it another attribute, or I should stop calling it an attribute. This is a prop or a property. So let's give it a prop of species and say equals quotes cat, and let's give it a prop of age. Let's say 5. Okay, and let's do the same thing for this next pet. So pet, let's give it a name of maybe barks a lot. Species of dog. Let's say age of 2. Okay, and then the third and final pet for now, we can just say name equals fluffy. Maybe the species is rabbit, and let's give it an age of 3. So these are the props or properties that we are giving to this component or passing into this component. So now the question becomes, how do we actually use these pieces of data within our component? Well, React could not possibly make this any easier for us. We just go down to our pet component function, and within the parentheses right after the word pet for this function, we just include a parameter. So let's just say right here in the parentheses, props. Okay, that's it. Now within the body of this function, we can access that data, right? Any of those attributes, or we should call them props or properties that we just added. So check this out. Instead of this first blank, this should actually be the pet's name. So do this with me. Just get rid of that first blank. And since we are within JSX, remember JSX is actually just JavaScript. So we just include a pair of curly brackets to do something dynamic or run a bit of JavaScript. And inside the curly brackets, we just say props, right, to work with that incoming data. And then we look inside it with a dot, and we just include the name that we're interested in, right, the property. So that's props.name. And then down in the preview, we see meows a lot is a blank, barks a lot is a blank, fluffy is a blank. So let's fill in this second blank. This would be the species. So get rid of that word blank, pair of curly brackets, and we say props.species. Cool, it's looking good. We see cat, dog, and rabbit down in the preview. And then finally, for the age, get rid of this blank, say curly brackets, props.age. Cool, so there we see the age values. Now this is great, but what if instead of just 3 pets, right, instead of just these 3, what if we had 300? In that case, it would be way too many to manually list the pet component over and over here again, right? And have to manually feed in the prop values for each of the 300 pets. Instead, in the real world, when you're working with any decent amount of data like that, you're usually going to be given an array of data, right? A big chunk of data. And you would want to programmatically loop through the array and do something once for each item in the collection. So that way, even if our array or collection of pets had 3,000 pets, we wouldn't have to list things out like this manually. Well, that's exactly what we're going to learn how to do in our very next lesson. We're going to learn how to loop through an array of items, in this case pets, within the context of JSX. Right? And we want to automatically or programmatically render the pet component once for each pet and feed it the appropriate data and props. This should be a lot of fun to set up. Let's keep things rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to programmatically loop through a collection of data within the context of JSX in order to render one component for each item in the collection. Let's dive right in. Okay, so in order to save a bunch of meaningless typing that has no educational value, I've already created this new raw JavaScript array of pet data. So right now, I want you to pause this video and find the link or resource for this lesson. It should be named something like reference copy and paste, or copy and paste code, or copy and paste data. Anyways, you'll find this link and then just copy this code in the JavaScript column into your clipboard. So just select this entire const pets equals square brackets, just copy that. And then back within the code pen that we've been working on throughout all of these lessons, up at the very, very top, even up above our app function, just create a new line at the top and paste in your clipboard. Just like this. Now, right away, I want to say that this is not the ideal or proper way to store data in memory with React. Don't worry, in our very next lesson, we'll learn about the Reactish or component way to store app data. For now, in this lesson, the only thing we're learning about or worrying about is how to loop through an array of data and render a component once for each of the items. Now, yes, there are only 5 pets in this array, but you can use your imagination and picture there could be 500 pets in the array. The point is, we need a way to automatically or programmatically loop through this collection of items and render a pet component once for each item. Right? Because we don't want to have to type that out manually for each pet. So the question becomes, how can we make that happen programmatically within the context of JSX here? Well, first, let's talk a bit about how JSX works. So check this out. You don't need to type this part in with me, but at the beginning of our unordered list within this JSX, we could just actually include curly brackets to include a bit of JavaScript. And then in JavaScript, to create an array, you can just have square brackets. And then inside this array, I could have one list item, right, that says hello. And then right after that list item, I could have a comma, right, just like an array, and then have another list item, and it could say, hey. Now, if we check the preview area, we see 2 list items, right, hello and hey. And we didn't have to do anything to convert this array into a string because it's already JavaScript. That's the beauty of JSX. It's not like at the end of defining this array, we had to say .join to convert it into a string. The point that I'm trying to make here is that within JSX, we are free to include JavaScript within curly brackets, and then you can literally just include an array, right? An array of elements or an array of components. So with that in mind, now I really want you to follow along and type this out with me. Within our unordered list, I want you to hollow out everything we have. So including the 3 pets that we've already included here, delete all of those and that array test hello, hey code I just typed in. So now we just have an empty unordered list. Now check this out. Within there, let's have curly brackets to include a bit of JavaScript. And then we know that our collection of data, right, that could potentially have 100 pets or 500 pets in it, it's in a constant variable named pets. So within our curly brackets in the unordered list, we can just say pets, and that's an array, just a JavaScript array. And in JavaScript, every array has access to a method named map. So pets dot map, in parentheses to call map. Now this specific code that I'm highlighting right now, this has nothing to do with React. This is sort of getting into the beauty of React. There's not tons and tons to learn about React. A lot of it is just your JavaScript skills being applied in general. What I'm getting at is we just want to return an array of elements or components. And in JavaScript, the map method works like this. Essentially, in these parentheses, you give it a function, and then it's going to call whatever function you give it once for each item in this collection of data. If that doesn't make perfect sense right now, that's okay. We're going to walk through this step by step right now. So within the parentheses of map, I want you to create a function with me. So function, parentheses, after those parentheses, curly brackets. Inside those curly brackets, we can drop down. Don't worry, in just a few minutes, we can convert this into an ES6 arrow function, so the code seems a bit more clean or minimalist, but for now, I want to actually really spell it out. Okay, so this function is going to get called once for each item in our collection or array. And the idea is that map is going to assemble or generate a new array. Here's how it works. Within the body of this function, whatever we return is what's going to get added onto a brand new array that map returns. If that doesn't make sense, that's okay. I think this will make things clear. So this function is going to get called once for each item. So within these parentheses, we want to add a parameter. We could name it anything, but let's just call it lowercase pet. Okay? Now within the body of this function, we can access the current pet that has been looped to via this parameter name of lowercase pet. This is where things might start to make sense. What we want to return is an uppercase pet component, right? Just like before. And we know that we want to give this props. So for example, we would give it a prop of name, and we would set that to equal, well, we don't actually need quotes here because we're not going to actually type in a new string of text. So get rid of the quotes, just name equals, and then to include JavaScript, it's curly brackets, and we would just say pet, lowercase pet, right, the current item in the array that's been looped to, dot name. And then we would want to give a prop of species for this component. So species equals, curly brackets, lowercase pet dot species. Let's give it a final prop of age. So age equals, curly brackets, lowercase pet dot age. And then finally, just for internal React performance reasons, we do want to include a prop named key. And let's set this to equal, curly brackets, pet.id. If you're wondering what ID is, you'll notice in our array, each pet has a unique ID value, and I just typed in random numbers. The idea is that React has this unique identifier or key to track each component or each instance of the component. Okay? Now, before we worry about cleaning this code up to use modern ES6 syntax, let's check out our preview area. Perfect. We see all 5 pets. This means that even if our array of data contained 5,000 pets, we just wrote this one little piece of code, and the entire collection is going to be converted into our pet components. So ultimately, this lesson didn't really have much to do with React inherently. However, it did begin to show us the true nature and usefulness of JSX. At this point, let's go ahead and convert this traditional anonymous function into a more modern ES6 arrow function. If you have no idea what that means, that's okay. Essentially, it's just a more modern JavaScript syntax that will make our code look a bit more clean or minimalist. And again, this syntax difference doesn't have anything to do with React. This is just general JavaScript knowledge. Okay, but go ahead and do this with me. So we can actually get rid of the word function here. And then since we have precisely one parameter, we don't need the parentheses around it. So you can get rid of the opening parentheses right before pet and the closing parentheses right after pet. Okay, now right after that parameter, we want to include the arrow symbol, which is just the equal sign and the greater than symbol squished together like this. Okay, now this code also does not need to sit on its own line. So we can get rid of this white space. Right before return, just backspace up so it sits on the same line of code. Let's do the same thing here. Right, we don't need this line break and white space here. So right before this closing curly bracket, just delete that so it's on the same line. Now, if the body of our function only contains one statement or one line of code, we actually don't need the curly brackets around the body of the function. So right after the arrow symbol, we do not need this opening curly bracket. So we can get rid of that. And then we also don't need this closing curly bracket right after the end of our pet component right here. So we can delete that. Okay, and then if the body of your function sits on the same line like this, you actually don't need to include the word return. It's just implied or assumed. So we can get rid of return. Cool. So that's a lot cleaner, and now this entire process of programmatically looping through an array can fit on a single line of code. And if we really stop and look at the code, it's very intuitive. You can glance at this and immediately see what's going on. And that's actually going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we're going to learn about perhaps the single most important topic in all of React. It's something called state. State is how we store the data of our app in memory with React. State really brings us back to the defining characteristic or the most impressive part of React. And that is that as our state data changes, React automatically re-renders our interface for us, without us needing to manually call render again, like we are currently doing at the bottom of this app. Right? Remember, we set a JavaScript interval that's going to fire once every second or every 1,000 milliseconds, and then we are manually calling render and re-rendering our application. This type of setup works, but it's not the typical or standard or ideal way of setting up React. As we'll see in our next lesson, we don't need to worry about calling render more than once. We can just render our application once, and then if we ever update its state, React is smart enough to know to re-render again on its own. If that doesn't make sense, that's okay. State is a big topic. I wouldn't expect you to understand it during my last 30-second ramble. That's why we're going to dedicate the entire next lesson to state. This should be a big moment in your React journey. I'm excited to jump through this with you, so let's keep things rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to begin answering the question, what is state? To get started, I actually want us to focus our attention to the very bottom of this code pen that we've been working on so far. So down at the bottom, we set an interval, and then we are manually calling the render method of our root once every second. And that's what's allowing our time to update every second. Now, even though we are constantly manually recalling the render method, this setup is actually not bad for rendering performance. Because React is still smart enough to perform its internal comparisons and only actually re-render the tiny parts of the DOM that actually need to be re-rendered. Now, yes, this time value is changing every second, but if you just froze time for a moment and one of these values stayed constant, I want you to think of that time value as a piece of state in our application, a piece of data. Now, if we think about it, there are tons of different types of events that could happen that could change state or that could change our app data. Now, in this example so far, the only type of event that we've accounted for is the passing of time, right? Every 1,000 milliseconds or every 1 second, that time value is going to be different, so then we are re-rendering. So in that sense, this manual approach of setting an interval of 1 second and re-rendering manually, this works, but what about other types of events that can change data? For example, a user could click on a button, or scroll the page, or type letters on their keyboard. The whole idea with React is that you and I don't want to have to babysit this render method. The whole idea behind React is that we just worry about managing our app's data or the app's state, and then as that state changes, React automatically re-renders things on its own. We don't have to keep telling it to render at the appropriate time. We just tell it to render once when the page first loads, and everything beyond that is up to React. So the question becomes, how do we use state? Or how do we access state? Or how do we start working with state data? Right? You've heard me say that many times, that we can store our app data in state, but how do we actually tell React to store something in its state? Well, this is where things get interesting. So right now I want you to follow along with me. Before we start using state, let's set this up so that this actually does not get called once every second. So I want you to select this root.render line, the entire line, and cut it into your clipboard. And then go ahead and get rid of this set interval 1000 milliseconds code. And then just paste back in your clipboard. So down in the preview area, you should still see your application, only now the time is not actually getting updated every second, right? Because we're only rendering once when the page first loads. So let's give ourselves a goal. Let's adjust our time area component so that it stores the current time in state. And then whenever we change that state value, React will just automatically re-render this for us. Let me show you how we can do this. I want you to scroll up to the very top of our code. So up at the very, very top, just add a new line and type this in with me. Const use state, and that's a lowercase u, but then an uppercase s. And let's set this to equal uppercase React dot use state. Essentially, the React library has a function named useState that lets us begin working with state data. All we're doing on this line of code is saving ourselves a bit of typing down in our actual code. Instead of having to type uppercase React.useState, we can just say useState. If we were working on our actual personal computers instead of CodePen, we would use require or import here. But because we're in CodePen right now, this is how we would set this up. Big picture, all you need to know is we now have this special React tool or React function named useState. At this point, let's go leverage useState within our time area component. So let's find our component. Here it is, the function that we named time area. And within the body of this function, maybe on a new line right above the return line, type this in with me. We're going to call that useState function. And within these parentheses, when we're calling useState, we get to give it an initial value. So in the parentheses, let's just set it to the current time. So a new instance of a date object, parentheses to call that date, and then dot to locale string, parentheses to call that. Okay, now React is going to store that current time value in a memory cell, right? It's going to store that little piece of state or that little piece of data for us. Now that's great, but you and I need a way to hold on to that place where it's storing the data, right? We don't just want this to sort of float off into outer space where only React can access it. We need a way to work with it. So at the very start of this line, let's place our cursor here, and I'm going to say const, and then we can make up a constant variable name. For now, let's just call it time equals, right? So we're storing whatever useState is going to return, we're storing it in this variable so that we can access it later on. However, useState does not just return a single entity. It returns an array with 2 items in it. The first item in the array that it returns is something that would let us access this current value, this current little piece of state. And the second thing that it returns to us is a function that we can call to update the value of this little piece of state data. Let me show you what I mean. So when we say const time, we don't just want one variable. We actually want 2 variables. So do this with me. Get rid of the time, and in its place, include an empty pair of square brackets for an array. What we're doing is we're going to destructure the array that useState is returning. In these square brackets, you can make up any 2 variable names that you'd like to make up, but I'm going to call them the time, comma, and the second name can be set the time. Okay, so now we have these 2 variables. The time is how we can access the state value, and set the time is how we can update the state value from its initial value that we declared here. So let's begin by using the time, right? Within the bit of JSX that we're returning in this function, when we say the current time is, well, let's just hollow out these curly brackets, right, to do something dynamic. And now, within those curly brackets, we can just say the time. Okay, now if we check the preview, you can see that things are still working. So now this is where it gets interesting. Within our time area component, we just want to wait 1 second and then update that piece of state data. So do this with me. Within our time area function, maybe right below this const line where we use useState, let's drop down. And this doesn't have anything to do with React. This is just general JavaScript, but we can say set timeout, parentheses to call it, and then we give it 2 arguments, right? A comma B. The first argument should be a function, and then the second argument is how many milliseconds you want to wait before calling this function once. So for the second argument, instead of B, we can say 1000 milliseconds. And for the first argument, instead of this placeholder A, we can just include an anonymous function. So function, parentheses, curly brackets. Within those brackets, we can drop down. And now this is where we can leverage set the time. So we just say set the time, parentheses to call it, and give it the new current time value. So again, that's a new instance of a date object, parentheses to call that, and then dot to locale string, parentheses to call that. Now don't worry, in just a moment I will explain what's going on here and how it works, but if we take a look at the preview area, you can see that once again, our time is updating every second. Let me walk through how this works. So when the page first loads and React renders time area for the first time, it's going to see useState, and it's actually going to store this value in a memory cell. Then we told our code to wait 1 second before we call set the time, which is going to update that value in state. Now when the state of a component changes, React is going to run that component again. So that means our time area function is going to run again in response to this state changing. So yes, technically this line of code is going to run again, but React is not going to actually set this as the value again. React is smart enough to know that this is not the first time that we are running this, right? And it's only going to use this as the initial value that we first declared. React can keep track of the fact that this is not the first time this component is rendering. We don't need to redeclare the initial value of that piece of state data. However, it is going to run all of our other code again, and it's going to say, hey, let's wait 1 second and update it again. And that process is just going to repeat endlessly, and that's why we have a timer that keeps going on. Now, right away, I do want to point out that set timeout is not the most optimal or ideal way of updating something once per second like this. Don't worry, in just a couple of lessons from now, we will learn about a React tool named useEffect, which will let us set up this timing situation in a more optimal fashion. But for now, this code definitely gets the job done. Okay, so this lesson was an example of updating state in response to the event of time passing, which admittedly maybe isn't the most crystal clear way of learning about state in React. So in our very next lesson, we're going to learn how to respond to the event of a user clicking on a button. We're going to add a brand new area and component to our page that keeps track of how many likes have been clicked. So there's going to be a button that increases the number of likes, and then another button that decreases the number of likes. And we're going to store that count or that number in state. This should feel like a much more natural or practical example of why state is so great and useful. I'm looking forward to jumping into this exercise with you, so let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to respond to events. So for example, when a user clicks on a button, how do we respond to that? Well, let's dive right into the action. So within the same code pen we've been working within, I want you to follow along with me. Let's find our main component, right? The function that is named our app. This is where we have our overall interface, right? The header, the time area, the pet list. And let's imagine that right below the header, we want to add a new area that says this page has been liked blank number of times. And then we will have a button where you can click it to increment that, right? So it says this page has been liked 1 time or 2 times or 3 times. And then there will be another button that you click to decrease the number of likes. Now, before we actually modify the JSX for our overall interface here, let's go create the component, and we can name it like area. So let's scroll down a bit. Maybe right above where we have the pet component function, right above that, we can just create a brand new function. Let's say function. Let's name it like area, parentheses, curly brackets. Let's drop down. Within the body of this function, let's have it return a bit of JSX. And it's safe to assume we're going to want to include multiple elements or multiple lines of code. So let's actually return a pair of parentheses, and then inside those parentheses, we can drop down. Okay, let's start with an overall React fragment, right? Because you can only have one top-level element in a bit of JSX. But now within this React fragment, we can have whatever content we want. So let's add maybe a heading level 2, and inside it say this page has been liked 0 times. Okay, and then maybe right above that heading level 2, let's add a button that a user can click on. So a button element. And inside the button tags, we can say increase likes. And then right below that button, let's have another button. So opening and closing button tags. And this button should say decrease likes. Okay, for now, this is all we need within our like area function. If you need to pause the video to type this out, that's okay. But now that we have this set up, let's go actually include the like area within our overall Our App. So back up in Our App, maybe just right below the Our header, let's just include like area, just like that. Now if we check out the preview area, cool, we see this page has been liked 0 times, and here we have the 2 buttons. Now at the moment when you click on these buttons, nothing happens because we didn't say that anything should happen. So right now, let me show you how we can respond to these buttons getting clicked on. Let's go ahead and find our function that is named like area. Now on this button that should increase the number of likes, on the opening button tag, let's add an attribute, or I should say a prop or property, with the specific name of onClick. And notice the C is uppercase, but onClick equals, and then let's include a pair of curly brackets. And then this is where we can just include the name of a function that we want to run whenever the button gets clicked on. Now we could just type out an anonymous function directly in these curly brackets, but to stay organized, why don't we do this? Within the body of this like area function, right above the return line, let's add a new line, just like this, and let's create a brand new function. So function, and we can name it anything we want, but just so we're on the same page, let's name it increase like handler. Parentheses, curly brackets, drop down. Okay, and just for a quick annoying test, within the body of this function, we can just say alert, thanks for clicking me. Okay, now down in our JSX for that increase button, within the onClick curly brackets, just include the name of that function, right? So increase like handler. Okay, let's go ahead and test it out. So now when I click on increase likes, perfect, we see that annoying alert message, thanks for clicking me. Now we don't actually want to display this annoying alert message. What we would actually want to do is increase this number or this count of likes. But before we make this button click do that, we first need to set up that number or count as a piece of data that lives in state. Let me show you what I mean. So back in our like area code, right, the function named like area, at the very top of the body of that function, type this in with me on a new line like this, use state, parentheses, and again that's an uppercase S for state, and within these parentheses, this is where we declare the initial value for the like counter or the like number. So let's just set that to 0. So React is going to take care of storing this value, but we want to be able to access this later on. So at the start of this line, let's say const and then square brackets. After the square brackets, equal sign. And remember, useState returns an array with 2 items in it. So we are destructuring the array that it returns. So in these square brackets, we're going to make up 2 variable names. You could choose any names, but just so we're on the same page, let's call it like count, comma, and set like count. So remember from our previous lesson, this first variable is how you can access the piece of state or the value, and this is a function that lets us update that same piece of state. So let's begin by using like count. Down within this bit of JSX where we say this page has been liked blank number of times, let's get rid of this hard-coded 0 here and instead include curly brackets and just say like count. Okay, now here's the fun part. Within our increase like handler function, instead of just this annoying alert message, we can use set like count to increase that number by 1. Let me show you what I mean. So let's get rid of this alert line and we can just say set like count, parentheses to call it. And now if we already knew the exact value we want to set it to, you could just type that value here. However, in this case, because we want to base our value off the previous value, right, we want to increment it or increase by 1, what we can actually do here is include a function. So function, parentheses, curly brackets. Let's drop down. Within the parentheses for this function here, let's include a parameter. Let's call it prev, short for previous. So yes, we know that the very first time the user clicks on the increase button that the previous value of likes would be 0. But the idea here is, what if the user's already clicked it a few times? In that case, we would need to know the previous value so we can add 1 to it. So within the body of our function, we're just going to return that previous value plus 1. Right? And then that new value is going to be set as the new like count within our state or app data. Okay, at this point, let's go ahead and test things out. So back in the preview area, this page has been liked 0 times, but if we click increase likes, cool. And you can click it as many times as you want. At this point, let's go ahead and set up the decrease likes button to subtract 1 from this piece of state. So let's find that decrease button in our JSX. Here it is. So on the opening button tag, let's say on click equals curly brackets, because we want to point towards the name of a JavaScript function instead of just a string of text. So you can imagine that we will have a function named decrease like handler. Okay, now we just need to go create a function with this matching name. Still within our overall like area function component, maybe right below our increase like handler function, we can just say function decrease like handler, parentheses, curly brackets. Within the body, let's just say set like count, parentheses to call that. Since we want to work with the previous value, we're actually going to supply a function within these parentheses. Why don't we use an ES6 arrow function this time? We will have exactly 1 parameter, so prev, short for previous, arrow symbol. Let's have a pair of curly brackets and then drop down. And let's just return the previous value minus 1. Okay, let's check out the preview area. So if I click increase and go up to maybe 10, and then click decrease, cool. Only notice I'm allowed to go below 0, right? Negative numbers. So we can just bake in a bit of logic within decrease like handler to not let you go below 0. So instead of just returning previous minus 1, we can get rid of that. And instead, let's write an if statement. So if parentheses, curly brackets. Within these parentheses for the condition, let's say only if prev is greater than 0. Okay, and then in these curly brackets, only if that's true, then return previous minus 1. And then after those curly brackets for the if, right, so if this is not true, if this doesn't happen, then we would just return a value of 0. So that way we don't let the user click to a negative number. So let's test this out again. Bump it up, and then if I try to go down, cool. The lowest it lets me go is 0. So altogether, this lesson was an example of responding to a user event by changing state. And then React responds to the state changing by re-rendering only the tiny part of the DOM that actually needs to be updated. So at this point, we've seen how to respond to an element being clicked on. And now in our very next lesson, we're going to learn how to work with form fields that a user could click on and then begin typing into. So in the next lesson, we're going to add a form that lets you add a new pet to the page. The form will have 3 fields where you can type the pet's name, species, and age. And then when you submit the form, the new pet will appear in the list. Not only will this teach us how to work with forms in React, but it will also be another great way to practice working with state. It should be a lot of fun, so let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to work with forms within React. Let's jump right into the action. So within this same code pen that we've been working on, we're going to add a form that lets a user add a new pet to the list. So right above the list, right about here, there will be a form with 3 fields where you can type a pet's name, species, and age. Now we have a lot to cover in this lesson, and so typing out a bunch of boilerplate HTML is probably not the best use of our time. So let me switch tabs. In the resources for this lesson, you'll find a link called Copy and Paste Form Starter. As you can see, there's nothing new going on in this code, so we're not missing an educational opportunity by just having you copy and paste this. It's just a function that's returning a bit of JSX, and there's nothing interesting going on here. So right now, pause the video, find this starter link, and then from here, just select everything in the JavaScript column. Just select all of this into your clipboard. Okay, and then back in the code pen that we've been working on together, I want you to paste that in. In terms of where you should paste it in, maybe right below our app function. So just in a brand new function that's not nested in any other function, just paste in your clipboard. Okay, now that we've added this add pet form to our code, let's actually leverage it. So back up in our app function, within our overall JSX, right above the unordered list of pets, let's just add in add pet form, just like that. Okay, now if we check the preview area, cool, there's the form. Now before we worry about extracting whatever values the user types into these fields, let's first just respond to the event of this form being submitted. Let me show you what I mean. So let's jump back to the JSX for that form, right? So within our add pet form function, and on the opening form tag, let's do this. Let's add a prop named on submit, and that's an uppercase S for submit, equals, and then curly brackets, and let's make up a function name that we can create in just a few seconds. We could call it anything, but let's say handle submit. Okay, then within this function, but maybe right above the return line, we can just create a function with that name. So function handle submit, parentheses, curly brackets. Now the next 10 seconds have nothing to do with React, and this just has to do with the way that web browsers and JavaScript work. But within the parentheses for this function, we want to include a parameter. Let's call it E, which is short for event. Essentially, whenever you submit a form in a web browser, the web browser's default behavior is to send that data off to a new URL or to a new location. But we don't actually want to reload the page. So we want to prevent that default behavior of the web browser. Now, this event parameter contains all sorts of information about the form submit event that just happened. So to prevent that default behavior, we can just say e dot and then call a method named prevent default. And again, this has nothing to do with React. This is just general web browser JavaScript. Okay, but right below that prevent default line, just as a test, maybe we have an alert that says Thank you for submitting the form. Okay, now let's test things out. So if we submit this form, perfect. We see that alert message. At this point, we need to ask ourselves, what do we actually want to do when the user submits this form? Well, from a React perspective, we'd want to take the values that they entered and update whatever state is driving this list of pets to now also include the data that was just typed into these fields. To make that happen, we actually need to step back from the form for a minute, and what we need to do is move our pet data to live inside the state of our app component. Let me show you what I mean. So up at the very top of our code, not living within any of our React functions, remember we have this array named pets, and it's just an array of objects, right? And this is what's driving that list of pets. Well, right now, do this with me. I want you to select the array. So from this opening square bracket here, select until the closing square bracket, and I want you to cut that into your clipboard. Okay, and then we can get rid of this const pets equals. And we want to move that data to live within state within this our app component. So up at the very top of that our app function, do this with me. Say use state, parentheses to call it, and in the parentheses, just paste in your clipboard. Okay, so now React is responsible for storing this data, but remember, we want to be able to access this again later on. So at the very start of this line, say const, and then square brackets equals. Inside the square brackets, say pets, comma, set pets. So ultimately, within our app, you can still access the pet data from a variable of lowercase pets. So our pet list still displays just fine. Only now we have this function named setPets that we can call to update this piece of state. Maybe now the bigger picture is coming into focus. So when someone submits the pet form, we want to take the data that they just typed in and we just want to push it onto this array of state data. Well, we're not actually going to push or mutate this exact array. Instead, we're just going to give a new array to React, and React can handle things from there. But the idea is that once we update that state, React will take care of re-rendering this part of the DOM. It won't even need to re-render any of the list. It will just render the new element that we just added to it. Enough talk for now. Let's put this into action. So let's go find our add pet form function. Here it is. And remember, we set up handle submit. Now, instead of showing an annoying alert, this is where we would want to update the state of the list of pets. However, we are about to run into our first real roadblock or challenge in terms of wrapping our minds around React. So really quick, if I scroll back up to where we set that state, right, and now we have this function named setPets that would allow us to update that state, well, we need to recognize that this is only available from within this function, the our app function. At the moment, we have no way of accessing this setPets from within our add pet form function. Now, there are many different ways to get around this issue in React, and we will learn about different strategies later on in the course. But for now, let me show you the simplest approach around this. Within our overall our app function, if we look at our JSX code, when we are rendering the add pet form component, we can just give it a prop of that setPets function. So right on this add pet form, let's just give it a prop of, we could give it any name we want, but let's say set pets, and just set it to equal, curly bracket, set pets. Okay, now let's go within this add pet form function and leverage that. So here is add pet form. Within the parentheses for that function, we just want to include a props parameter. Okay, and now check this out. Instead of the annoying alert message, we can get rid of that. And what we actually want to do is just call props.setPets. And now, before we worry about accessing whatever values the user types in, let's first just practice adding a new pet to our state with fake hard-coded values for its name, species, and age. So within the parentheses for set pets, we know that we want the new value to be based on the previous value. So we're going to give this a function. Let's use an ES6 arrow function. So we just need one parameter. Let's call it prev, short for previous, arrow symbol. And then we don't even need curly brackets if we just want to stay all on one line here. And we don't even need the word return. Now we don't want to modify the state directly. We're not going to get into the why behind that right now. It's too big of a topic for this lesson. But essentially, in React, you don't want to directly mutate the state. You just want to give React the new desired value and let React handle things from there. So we can begin working with the old array, only instead of using a method like push, which would directly change it, we can use a method named concat. Concat will return a brand new array instead of modifying the old array, and we just give it a new item that we want to combine with the old array. So within these parentheses, let's create an object, so curly brackets, and now let's just give it fake hard-coded name, species, and age, just as a test. So let's say name, colon, let's give it a name of test name, comma, let's give it a species, colon, quotes of dog, comma, let's give it an age of 2, comma, and for its ID, let's just give it a value of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, if you need to pause the video to type this in with me, that's okay, but let's go ahead and test this out. So in the preview area, let's scroll down. We don't even need to type anything into these fields, just go ahead and submit the form. Cool. Notice that at the bottom of our pet list, we see that new object that we just coded. So now, instead of these fake hard-coded values, let's actually pull the values that the user has entered into the fields. Now this is actually where a lot of people get confused while learning React. Because remember, in React, the DOM is never our source of truth. So we are not going to manually read the values from these fields, right, directly from the DOM. Instead, we're going to listen for the event that the value of a field changes. And then every single time a field changes its value, we're going to store its newest value in state. So then that way, when the user actually submits the form, we don't need to go retrieve any values from the DOM. We can just work with data that is already in state. I realize that might sound really confusing, but once we see it in action, I think it'll make sense. So right now, let's jump into this. Dive back into the code with me and find our function that is named addPetForm. Within the body of that function, so right about here, we want to create 3 new pieces of state. So type this in with me. Let's say const square brackets. We can name it anything we want, but let's say name, comma, set name, and set that to equal useState. So we're just going to create one piece of state for each of the 3 fields. So the first field was the name. The second field is the species of the pet. So let's say const square brackets, species, comma, set species, and that should equal useState. Okay, and then finally, let's say const square brackets, age, comma, set age equals useState. Okay, now let's go use these functions that let us update state whenever one of the fields changes their values. So if we scroll down to the JSX for the form, here's the first field, right? This is the name of the pet. So on this opening input tag, we can just add a prop named onChange equals curly brackets. And now we could create a function with a name and then point towards that function, or we can just include an anonymous function here. Why don't we actually just create an ES6 arrow function? So we would have exactly one parameter. Let's call it E for event. This contains all the information about the key press event that just happened. Arrow symbol. And then this is where we would want to call our set name function, so parentheses to actually call it. And then in these parentheses, let's pass it e.target.value. So again, E is the event that just occurred. Target is the element that just had the event happen to it, this input field, and then we're just grabbing the value from that input field. Okay, now in order to save a bit of typing, let's just copy and paste this for the species and age fields. So just select from onChange to that closing curly bracket, copy that, and then on the species input, right after the input, just paste it in. All we need to change is instead of set name, this would be set species. And let's do the same thing for age. So right after the word input, paste it in and change set name to set age. Okay, at this point, we can rest assured that our state always has the most updated values from those fields. So check this out. Let's just find our handle submit function. And instead of these fake hard-coded values of test name and dog and age of 2, well, we can get rid of test name. We would actually just want it to point towards our variable named name. And in modern JavaScript, when the name of your property is the same thing as the value that you want it to have, you can actually just get rid of the value and the colon. So you can just say the property name, right? Because that piece of state that points towards that latest value is just name. The same thing with species and age. So for species, we don't need the colon and the value of hard-coded dog. We can just say species. Same thing with age. And for ID, let's do this. Let's say ID colon, and then get rid of the hard-coded 1 through 6, and just say uppercase date dot now, parentheses to call it. That will give it a unique number each time you create a pet. Okay, at this point, let's test out our form. So add new pet. Let's say test cat. Species is cat, age is 4. Go ahead and submit that. Cool, there we see it. However, what if the user wanted to add another pet? You'll notice that the old values are still in the fields, and it would be nice if they automatically cleared out so you didn't have to manually delete these old values to add a new pet. So let me show you what we can do. Within our handle submit function, right after we add that new pet, still within that function, we can just drop down. And remember, we already have these conveniently named functions that let us update the state. So let's just update them to an empty string, like this. Set name, just an empty string. Set species, empty string. Set age, empty string. Okay, now we just need to tell those input fields in our JSX to actually use the state as their value. So we just come down here. Here's the input for name. We can just give it a prop or an attribute of value should equal curly brackets name. And then the species, so value equals curly brackets species, value equals curly brackets age. Okay, let's test it out again. Come down to the form, test dog. Species is dog, age is 2. Go ahead and submit. Cool, so not only was it added to our list, but notice these fields were automatically cleared out for us. And that's actually going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we'll learn how to add delete buttons next to each pet so that you can remove a pet from the list. And we'll also learn how to set things up so that when you reload the page, any new data that you added is not lost. Now that feature of persisting the data doesn't have anything to do with React, but we're going to learn about it because it's a great excuse to learn about a tool in React named useEffect. useEffect does not inherently have anything to do with persisting data. useEffect is simply a very useful tool that can be used in a million different types of situations. And learning how it works is a huge part of moving forward with React. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to put the finishing touches on our simple example application, and we're also going to learn about a tool in React named useEffect. Let's get started by adding a delete button next to each of the pets in our list. So to add that button, let's find our pet component. For me, it's around line number 79 or 80, but it's probably a bit different for you, but we're just looking for the function named uppercase pet. And right before the closing list item tag, we just want to add a button here. Now you don't need to do this, but because my screen is really zoomed in and I can't fit much on the screen at once, I'm actually going to wrap this bit of JSX in parentheses so that I can drop down. And I'm really only doing this so that before the closing list tag, I can drop down to add the button element here. And this way it will fit all on one line on the screen. So it's easier for you to see and follow along with me. Okay, within this button, let's have a bit of text that says delete. And then what do we want to do when the user clicks on this button? Well, let's add a prop named onClick equals curly brackets. And then we can make up a name for a function. So we haven't created this function yet, but we will in just a few seconds. Let's say handle delete. Okay, now within this overall pet function, we just need to create a function with this name. So let's say function handle delete, parentheses, curly brackets. Okay, and now within this function, this is where we need to stop and actually think about what we're trying to accomplish. So what we need to do is determine the ID of the pet that we just clicked delete on. And then we want to go into the state of all of our pets, find the item that has that matching ID, and remove it from the array. So let me show you how I would do that. Before we actually work on this handle delete function, let's go up to our overall our app component, right? So it's towards the top function our app, and let's look at the JSX, right? Our header area, the like area, and then we have this unordered list where we're looping through the pets. And then here we see the uppercase pet component. Well, let's add a few props to it. So after uppercase pet, let's say ID equals curly brackets, and let's just give it pet.id. Okay, and then we need to realize that we want to be able to update the state of our pets from within the pet component. And remember, that state of all of our pets actually lives in the our app component, not the pet component. So while we're here, let's also add one more prop named set pets and set it to equal curly brackets set pets, right? This is that React function that lets us change the state or update the state. Okay, with both of these props in place, let's go back down to our pet component. Okay, and now we can actually work on our handle delete function. So here's what we want to do. We want to call the props.setPets function, right? Because we want to change the state. We want to remove an item from that array of pets in state. So within these parentheses, it's our job to give it a new array with all of the pets except for the one that we just want to get rid of. Now that means we're going to need to work with the previous state value. So let's give this an arrow function. There's the previous state, arrow symbol. So let's start working with the array of pets or the previous state. And again, we don't want to call any methods on this array that would mutate it or directly change it. So instead, we can call a method named filter. Filter has nothing to do with React. It's just a part of JavaScript. So every array in JavaScript has access to filter, and it will return a brand new array. How it works is you give it a function, and it's going to run that function once for each item in the array. Now in that function, if you return a value of true, that current item you've looped to will be included in the new array that filter is generating. If you return a value of false, it will be skipped. So all we really need to do is provide a function that returns true unless the ID of the pet matches the ID of the pet button that we just clicked on. Within the filter parentheses, let's say pet to work with the pet that we've looped to. We're just creating an ES6 arrow function. And we're just going to return true if pet.id does not equal the ID of the pet that just got clicked on. So to access that ID, it would be props.id. And that's it. That's all we need to do. React will take care of everything else. So let's test this out. Let's come down to our list. Maybe I want to get rid of Fluffy the rabbit. Click delete. Perfect. Or if I add a new pet, test cat, age of 6 years old, that gets added. But if I want to remove it, just click delete. Okay, so we've completed our delete feature. At this point, let's change gears and set things up so that when the page gets reloaded, we don't lose our data. I'm sure you've noticed that anytime you change your code in CodePen, it reloads the preview area, and in our case, that means we lose any data we've manipulated. Now, this idea of persistent data in the web browser has nothing to do with React and everything to do with just the nature of web browsers. But that doesn't matter. This is still the perfect excuse to learn about something in React named useEffect. So let's do this. Let's go up into our code towards the top within our main our app component. And let's make it so that when you first visit the page, none of these pre-existing or hard-coded pets exist. We really only ever added these pets as an example so we had something to work with. But now that we have a form that you can fill out to add pets, we don't need these anymore. So when we're saying use state and then we have square brackets and then these items, just delete all of the items and then get rid of the empty space just like this so that it says pets, use state, and then it's just an empty array, right? An empty pair of square brackets. So now down in our preview, obviously there are no pets to see. And now when someone adds a pet to the form, not only do we want to add that new pet to state, but we want to somehow persist that data in the web browser so that even if you reload the page, that data still exists. Now, even though that's more about web browsers and less about React, let me show you how we will achieve this within the context of React. So maybe right below this line when we're setting our pets state, let's add 2 comments for ourselves just to stay organized. So / to add a comment, and let's say only run once the first time this component is rendered. Okay, and then below that, let's add one more comment and say run every time our pet state changes. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to leverage the web browser's local storage feature. Local storage has nothing to do with React, but it's how we can have persistent data within a web browser. So the very first time our component is rendered, we're going to load any existing data from local storage, load it into state. But then we also want to save our latest data back into the browser's local storage. So anytime our pet data changes, we're going to save our pet state back into the browser's local storage. Now, this whole situation of needing to do something during a certain circumstance like this is where useEffect comes into play. So let me show you what we're going to do. For this first situation, we can say useEffect. Now, I should point out that just like we needed to include or create this shortcut named useState, we need to do the same thing for useEffect. So up at the very top of our code, let's add a new line and say const useEffect equals uppercase react.useEffect. Okay, so now we can actually access it by just typing useEffect. Okay, so we're actually using it here, and we want to give useEffect 2 things. So we could say A, B. While we're at it, why don't we also go ahead and use this same code under this comment, right? When we want to do something every time our pet data state changes. So useEffect A, B. Now, the first argument is a function that you want to run, and the second argument is where you list the dependencies or the things that you want to watch for changes, and then only when React detects that those things have changed, only then will it actually call your function. So let's focus on this example first. We only want this function here to run the very first time that this component is rendered. Now to do that, instead of this B placeholder for the second argument, we just provide an empty array. Now down in this example, we want this function to run every time our pet state changes. So instead of this B placeholder, we would have an array, and the only item in that array that we want to watch for is our pets state. Now, in case I didn't make it clear before this moment, by default, any code that lives within a component function is going to run every time that component gets re-rendered. So useEffect is our way of including code within our component, but only actually running it at the specific times that we want to run it. Okay, at this point, let's focus on the function that we want to run only the first time that the component is rendered. So instead of the A placeholder, we can include an arrow function. So empty set of parentheses, and then the arrow symbol, curly brackets, and then inside those drop down. Okay, and actually, before we write what we want to do here, why don't we also add an arrow function for this second useEffect? So instead of that A placeholder, empty set of parentheses, arrow symbol, curly brackets. I think it actually makes more sense to begin with this function that we want to run every time our pet state changes. So if the pet data changes, we would want to save it to the web browser's local storage. So write this out with me within this second useEffect. Let's say local storage, this is just a universal web browser feature, dot set item. So every modern web browser has access to this feature, and we give this two arguments, so a comma b. The first argument is a name that you make up for this piece of data that the browser is going to store. So instead of a, why don't we call it quotes, maybe example pet data. Okay, and then instead of the second argument, or the placeholder b, we would just want to store our pets data. However, our pets data is an array, whereas local storage in the browser only accepts a simple string of text, not actual code or data. So to get around this, here's what we can do. We can say JSON, that's all uppercase, JSON dot stringify, parentheses to call that, and then just include our state, right, or our data, lowercase pets. So this is a web browser feature that will turn our data into a string of text, and then we're saving it in local storage. Cool, so now React will take care of running this each and every time our pet state changes. Now within this useEffect, we only want to run this when the component is first rendered, and this is where we would want to load any data from the web browser's local storage if it exists. So this is where we would say if, parentheses, curly brackets. For the condition, we would say only if local storage dot get item, parentheses, only if example pet data, only if it actually exists, then we would want to load it. So within these curly brackets, we could drop down and say set pets, right? This is the function that lets us update our state within the component. Okay, and then before we actually pull in the data from the browser's local storage, we would first want to parse it. Because remember, what's stored in the web browser is just a string of text. But we want to parse it so that it's actual JavaScript data, so that it's actually an array of objects. So to do that, we just say uppercase JSON dot parse, and then we would just pull in that string from local storage. So local storage dot get item, and then remember we named it example pet data. Okay, at this point, let's test out the feature. So if we add a new pet, test cat, age of 4, and add it, as expected, we see it here, but now if we cause the page to reload, so maybe in our code, if we get rid of this comment, just to trigger CodePen to reload the example area, if we check it, that data is still there. Perfect. So now if you saved your CodePen and you closed your browser and then you pulled this CodePen back up even a week or two from now, that data would persist. And even though persistent data has nothing to do with React, you're starting to see how useful the useEffect hook function can be. Let me put that comment back. Since everything in React is based around our state, it's incredibly powerful to be able to run custom functions whenever a certain piece of state changes. If you're still not crystal clear on why useEffect is so great, that's okay. Trust me, we are going to use it many times throughout this course. In fact, right now, let's improve our time area component by leveraging useEffect. Let me show you what I'm getting at. So in our code, let's find that time area component. For me, it's around line number 102. It's probably in a different spot for you, but we're just looking for time area function. And currently, we're using set timeout, and we're waiting 1 second before we update the state with the new time. And then that's going to cause this function to re-render again, which is going to run this code again, and that's going to create sort of an infinite loop of that. So instead of us needing to constantly recreate a new timeout and recreate a new timeout, it would be more efficient if we used an interval instead of a timeout. An interval is just an ongoing instance in the browser that's going to fire the function once every second. Now in the past, before we knew about useEffect, we couldn't use setInterval because remember, this function is going to rerun every time the state changes. And we wouldn't want to have an ongoing or infinite number of intervals going. However, with useEffect, we can run a bit of code only the first time this component renders. Let me show you what I mean. So in order to save a little bit of typing, I want you to copy this line into your clipboard, just this set the time line here where we're pulling in the toLocale string. Copy that. Okay, and then we can get rid of this set timeout area, and instead we can use useEffect. useEffect. Remember, it takes two arguments, a comma b. For the second argument, or the b placeholder, let's say an empty array. Right? That's how you say you want something to run only the first time it renders. Okay? And then instead of the a argument, let's include an arrow function. So empty parentheses, arrow symbol, curly brackets, and then let's drop down. Okay, and now here is where we can use set interval instead of set timeout. So we could say set interval. This also gets two arguments, so a comma b. The second argument is how many milliseconds you want to wait in between each call, so 1000. And the first argument is a function that you want to run. So we could just include an arrow function. We don't even need curly brackets, and then you could just paste in your clipboard. Okay, and if we check our preview area, cool. So our timer is still working, only now the web browser isn't having to constantly recreate a timeout and recreate a timeout endlessly. There's just one interval that continues to run, but our code isn't going to continually rerun that and create new intervals because useEffect is only going to call this the very first time our component renders. Now, this isn't super important in this simple of an application, but in the real world, whenever you're doing something in the future, you want to be able to cancel it or negate it if this component gets unmounted or removed from the page before this action completes. So for example, our application was more complex and you could navigate to a new screen that did not need to show the time. Well, then this time area component would be unmounted or it would no longer be displayed. And in that case, we would want to clear the web browser's set interval, right? Because then it would just be a waste of computer resources. So here's what we can do. At the start of this set interval line, we can create a constant variable. Let's call it just interval equals. Okay, and then below this line, but still within the useEffect function, whatever we return within our useEffect function is what's going to be used as its cleanup function. So let's just give it an arrow function, and then we can use the web browser's clear interval function, and we would just clear the interval that we just named interval. Big picture, within useEffect, you can return a function that React is intelligent enough to use as your cleanup function, so that if this component is no longer needed on the screen, well, the web browser has a way of cleaning up your side effects or your effects. Now, if you've made it this far, give yourself a pat on the back, because we have completed the 10 days of React, or the first chapter in this course. So where do we go from here? Well, there is definitely more to React than what we've covered so far, but the building blocks that we've covered in these 10 lessons form the foundation of what makes React so special. From here, we're going to change gears and start building an actual real-world application with a decent bit of complexity to it. So in the next chapter, we're going to start creating a social media app together. Now, creating the backend and writing the code that directly queries the database is completely outside the scope of a front-end course about React. But rest assured, in this app, we are absolutely going to be working with a real backend. We just aren't creating the backend. It's pre-created. The idea, though, is that we're going to learn everything you need to know about React in order to build a responsive, blazingly fast user interface that seamlessly communicates with real data or a real backend. At this point, we've eaten our metaphorical broccoli, and this is where our progress is just going to start skyrocketing. I'm so excited to jump into this with you, so let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next chapter.
Hey, congratulations on finishing this Intro to React video. If you enjoyed my teaching style, be sure to check out my complete React course, where we build a meaningful spa together. You can find a link to join my complete course in the description and in the pinned comment. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you soon.